So naturalism, again, an offshoot of realism, but again, the very dilemma of where exactly to put across these literary trends and as to give them what date is something like Nietzsche. Think of Friedrich Nietzsche. He was influenced certainly by French, and the French were also stimulated by the English, and vice versa. Russia borrowed heavily from these English, say, literary masters, the French one, but somehow the Russians very rapidly, very abundantly, they repaid it in innumerable manners. So when it comes to clearly depicting these things, these boundaries are so much porous in themselves. They so much are porous and kind of very legitimately, in fact, porous and quite subordinate to the very idea of being clear-cut, that you cannot probably compartmentalize them and neatly draw out the boundaries or the margins of these ones. And that is why the next one, that is naturalism, we are studying. Naturalism is the very offshoot of realism, which moved a bit ahead and started to emphasize the idea of environment, started to take into picture the idea of how nature and its forces exert its influence on different human beings, and the need to, say, narrativize these experiences in fiction as well. So naturalism naturalism was as a tendency from the 1880s to 1930s that used detailed realism to suggest that social conditions, heredity, and environment had inescapable force in shaping human character. It was mainly an unorganized literary movement that sought to depict believable everyday reality, as opposed to the movements of romanticism or surrealism, in which subjects may receive highly symbolic, idealistic, or even supernatural treatment of the matter. So naturalism, as I said, was an offshoot of, or it was an appendage of realism. So it stemmed from realism really, but emphasized the more brutal aspects of existence. That is, some critics have gone to the extent of calling it as a real realism. What were the principles of it? On what principles was it operating? It set itself out within the, say, boundaries of nature. It says that, of course, man is not alone in the entire universe. The universe is quite an unsparing one, an uncaring universe. The universe, again, is governed by certain laws. These are the laws of nature. Think of social Darwinism. So think of the natural theory of selection that Darwin has presented. And the next thing that we are going to discuss, think of no divinity, no cycles, no tales, no God coming down to kind of rescue human beings from their misery. So man is at the whims of such forces that he cannot control, and the dominion of, or the superiority of these natural forces on human, again, the superiority of these circumstances, of these natural forces on human, was something increasingly underscored in naturalistic fiction, or broadly speaking, naturalism. So naturalism probably has nothing to do with the study of ecofeminism or transcendentalism. In fact, I'd like to draw a comparison of naturalism with that of transcendentalism. But of course, after we get an understanding of what literary realism was and how it evolved. So naturalism was an outgrowth of literary realism, influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Whereas realism sought only to describe subjects that they really were, naturalism attempted to determine scientifically the underlying forces. For example, the very idea of environment, the hereditary forces, the natural forces which come into being, influencing the actions of its subjects. Naturalistic works, they included the supposed sordid subject matter. For example, think of Emile Zola's frank treatment of sexuality. Emile Zola, an important, very extremely important, almost a precursor, a trailblazer of this naturalism, a pervasive pessimism. Naturalistic works tend to focus on the darker aspects of life, including poverty, racism, violence, prejudice, disease, corruption, prostitution, filth. As a result, nationalistic writers were frequently criticized for focusing too much on human vice and misery. Now, in fact, here itself, I'll tell you how this was different from realism as well. Realism was equally depicting poverty. It was talking about violence. It was talking about corruption, diseases, the kind of general degradation of the society. But where was it different? The difference was with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, theory of origin of species, came the very unparalleled success. It somehow coincided with the unparalleled success of science and technology. And here, the entire, if I may say so, or probably for the lack of a better word, the entire European civilization, it started to move towards a significant scientific ethos. So how they ought to view the world, this now started to change completely. This position was changed thanks to this particular work, Origin of Species. Although atheism had been there, although the very notion of the reality of God or the existence of God might have been questioned, it might have been there, but somehow Darwin made it possible to make these denizens, to make these philosophers, to make the common man to be a fully legitimized, intellectually fulfilled atheist. So this atheism somehow, which was still seen, a question of existence of God, which was still seen in notions of metaphysics and transcendentalism, which was really not backed by any scientific say proofs or data behind, somehow Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And this is where, prior to say Darwin, the entire divine design, which was still governed in the name of or under the name of religion, they started to get questioned. Why? Because the explanation of that very biological origins, the explanation of that the divine design may be unnecessary, the divine grander design of God might be questioned, its reality of it or its existence might be put into a lot of questioning. This in a way changed the ethos of the common man as to his belief whether or not there is any explanation behind a third party or a grander intervention or a deity intervention really taking place. So this entire natural world was now being increasingly shifted to a more scientific world, and how the environment in a way has so much of its impact that it is beyond the control of even human beings sometimes. Then the broader zeitgeist and factors of literary naturalism, as it says, Darwin says it's a natural selection, not a divine blueprint of some sort that determines which organisms live and which die. Marx says, Karl Marx, he was also, masses are at the mercy of capitalists, of the economy, which more often than not, they would certainly exploit them. Freud says, psychoanalysis would come in, that we are at the mercy of our dark internal drives and desires and the subconscious and unconscious mind, and we can scarcely hope to control them. So all these factors somehow made common man or the everyman realize that how less of a power or the very existence of free will that can be questioned, and this is something its depiction can be found in the literary naturalism as well. Another side of natural nature was controlling our destiny and controlling our destiny as to where a human being takes birth, where ultimately how they die, the desire for food, shelter, sex, social dominance, everything is something to an extent beyond the control of that very human. So that idea of free will was put into that very question. Naturalism doesn't just focus on nature's influence, it encompasses many environments. There had been a man-made environment, financial environment, industry environment, economy environment, something always beating them down and controlling the lives of lowly individuals. So it's something like, if I think of how in, say, the naturalism was the very product of the natural shift, of the radical shift that came in culture. It's very much like the shift now moved from agrarian societies to a more industrial society, and how these citizens, when they're making these inhabitants, when they're making a movement from this side of it to the other side, to the cities and metropolitans, how they were very much under the control of the entire system, the working system, to which they had certainly less of an impact. And this is where it somehow intrigued that very man, how far can he exercise his very own free will, right? So in literary, as far as that literary naturalism, as I was talking about, this environment could be the factory system. This environment could be the proletariats who are working in a particular, particular setup, organizational setup, and how these environmental forces, how the control of their rules, regulations, policies, and so forth, they were controlling the free will of the man. And then the example that I took, that think of these inhabitants, these rural dwellers making a shift to the city, and of course to the larger say the metropolitans, and when they were moving here to the city, how the forces of these different smaller and larger environments would control their very existence. So naturalist work, literary works were more likely to be political than traditional realist work, because now it would give the writer an apt how naturalism was the product of the radical shift in the cultural meaning that comes with the transition from, say, a previous society of romanticism to the final one. And of course, in literary naturalism, the shift now becomes more braver. The ugly side of these institutions, where the environments within these man-made environments, apart from the natural force out there, this also started to become, as an experience, create different innuendos for these characters, which somehow get accounted in narratives as well. And since this, I believe this has already been discussed, so I'm on 21st, literary naturalist, the house and why from Epistemology. So the precise meaning of the term varies across different disciplines. A literary critic, philosopher, theologian, and a political sciences would each use the term differently, but in its broadest sense, they all are referring to different environmental forces that have, for example, the very fiasco that happened just now. This was beyond our control. We somehow were trying, both of us were trying at our end to, get rid of this problem that happened. And of course, this fiasco was beyond our control for the moment. The environment out there, which puts out certain challenges and limitations to our smooth functioning. So in its broad sense, naturalism is a doctrine holding the physical world operating according to the laws as discernible through empirical science. So the naturalist method, modeled after 19th century innovations in the experimental sciences, involved informed, systematic observations of the material world. So what do I mean by experimental sciences that has been written? By 18th century, we see that the different branches of sciences emerge as different disciplines, as areas of knowledge, and this somehow allowed knowledge to get systematized in itself. So astronomy was particularly taking into account the study of the various extraterrestrial planets and beings out there. If not beings, extraterrestrial elements, planets, the stars making a movement and so forth. And by now, unlike the 15th, 16th century, where they were still testing the grounds, where they were still testing the waters, and they would repeatedly get reputations, and how it also gets, the different historical changes also gets transferred to, or also get witnessed in the literary spheres as well. Here was a time where the scientific explorations were rightly backed by right theories. The hypotheses now were finally tested, and what proved to be, can be now backed by verifiable data, verifiable checking of the facts. So in other words, empiricism established itself fully formed, and that is why these natural forces that governed the sciences were not beyond, say, human recognition or human way of interpretation. Next, we move ahead. For the naturalist thinker, human beings were nothing more than the part of the world, like rocks, plants, animals. They were subjected to the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, which governed the human behavior as inexorably as they could govern the natural world. So naturalism was this taking into account the materialistic as well as the anti-realist. Now, a slight difference from realism here. Realism was again talking about the idea of materialistic society, or the thing as a material out there, which made the subject matter of the fiction. But here, these institutions appeared in its ugliest verse. How they would, with all its exploitation, would change the course of, or which change the destiny of a common mankind, or probably a common every man. This is something was not seen as realistically as it was set in the literary realism. So naturalism thus became more materialistic, it was taking into account a great deal of materialism and anti-realism that does not recognize the existence of non-material or non-observable phenomena. So anything which was beyond the interpretations of science was not considered as all as meaningful, and therefore would not be the subject matter of fiction. It is also anti-humanist in that it grants no exceptional status to human beings. Every action taken by a human being, according to the strict naturalist view, has a cause in the physical plane. Human behavior is thus entirely determined by the laws of cause and effect in the material world. So how it got, say, its delineation in literature, how it got, say, literary naturalism that we are talking of. So the naturalist writers, they clearly believe that the laws that were behind these forces, they somehow govern the human lives. And this is something when you study and understand them, these version of the scientific methods can be included in the novels as well. So they studied human beings governed by their instincts and passions, as well as how their passions and instincts get in a way affected by these, or governed by the forces of hereditary, by the forces of external environment, by the forces of natural laws, natural forces, and so forth. Its most vocal advocate was French author Émile Zola, 1840 to 1902, a prolific novelist, dramatist, essayist, and critic, someone who depicted reality and the naturalism aspect of it, the naturalist aspect of it, in its most ugliest form. Highly controversial in the period between heyday of realism, the emergence of early forms of modernism at the end of the century, naturalism in France was closely identified. In fact, it was synonymous with Zola's fiction that few claim the label after his death. So you might find the fictions by, or the depictions by, or the performance for that matter, by Anton Chekhov, Henrik Ibsen, August Strindberg, or go into the stories, you have Guy de Maupassant, all of these writing short stories, novellas, dramas, and other performances. But when it comes to the stark comparison with Émile Zola, he was something very, in the most starkest sense of the word, he was depicting reality and the natural forces in its most pessimistic and ugliest form. So the widespread translation of his work, that is Émile Zola, we are taking into consideration, however, gave Zola a global influence and led to the emergence of naturalist schools around the world. The influence of his naturalism can be found in Russia, and then again, because Russia had taken a lot from France and of course from the neighboring countries, but at the same time, when it comes to giving back, Russia probably gave in terms of its culture, became somehow a cultural center once, right? So in Western European nations and in the nationalist charge in the United States were led by Franz Norris. He dubbed the boy Zola by contemporary critics. As stated by contemporary critics, he was the boy Zola. Although Norris is now considered somewhat of a secondary figure in United States and the literature of United States, the naturalist aesthetic he popularized influenced the major 20th century writers such as Upton Sinclair, John Steinbeck, Theodore Dreiser, etc. In fact, Theodore Dreiser, what the aim of these naturalist writers had been, there would always be a romantic dilemma at the heart of a naturalist narrative. How the naturalist characters would somehow try and pursue an ideal, but that pursuit of ideal would certainly put them into certain kind of motion. At the same time, this was something beyond their achievement. And this idea that lures them on, that forces them to pursue it afterwards, but the material forces which are now stopping them, which are holding them back, the very dichotomy of it, and the position in which this man now remains would be the subject matter of these novels, especially Theodore Dreiser. Think of Norris Teague, think of Dresser's An American Tragedy. They all dealt with this so-called dilemma of when this man went ahead in his pursuits, but certainly by the materialistic forces outside their control, beyond the man's control, the character control would somehow stop them and pull them back. Criticism. Now, what all had been the number of criticism? So criticism, there was a lot of ambiguity over its well-defined boundaries. In fact, it often has an overlapping boundaries with Gothic, transcendental, realist, and psychological realism as well, even surrealism. Of the American naturalism, it has never been a self-conscious school, nor have its practitioners issued some systematic theories. It is even situated alongside the more polite realism of such writers such as William Dean Howells or Henry James. The comparison is both necessary. Now, what comparison are we talking of? The comparison with transcendentalism, or for that matter, the Romantic. Now, transcendentalism, the very thread that took into account by these American writers, if Emile Zola was, of course, picking up naturalism, then his followers somehow, and the very notion of transcendentalism, which again took into account natural force. The only difference was transcendental naturalism was somehow a very positivist way of, a very positive and looking ahead with natural forces helping them emerge as pieces of success, or these naturalist forces being the very source of spiritual energy. While with the other hand, that is on the other hand, this literary naturalism, or generally speaking naturalism, was a very negative source which won't allow the progress or the natural force of action by these so-called characters to take place. Now, an additional complication is that some authors said to exemplify naturalism, such as Dreiser, are also hailed as landmarks of realism. Further confusion resulted from archetypical naturalists. Now, because I said the boundaries were not clear-cut, but the common denomination among all these different isms that became somehow an offshoot of it, for example, Thomas Emerson's transcendentalism and literary naturalism, was that the naturalist force in transcendental by Emerson was more like a beneficial one, while the natural forces in literary naturalism was more like a hostile, or at least more indifferent to the needs of the character. Then, the plausible answers as to the epistemological challenges that naturalism offered. One way of resolving this confusion is to consider realism and naturalism as existing on a continuum, right? That the very fact that naturalism is nothing but in its most worst form, or in its condemnation, it is a kind of, it certainly was an offshoot of realism, but the worst of it, the ugliest form of realism, should be probably naturalism. But the one way of resolving this is to see them both in continuum, and that rightly so, it has to be taken as such. Both employ descriptive detail and social themes, but realism tends to adopt more conventionally moral positions, while seemingly less extreme, less pessimistic, and less simply bizarre than naturalism. And the case with American naturalism, the fact that they did not lay down clear-cut rules and theories as to what constitute the idea of literary naturalism in United States, keeping in mind the different challenges from the French or the England or the Russian one. The American naturalism demonstrated that literary modes were not absolute categories, they were flexible approaches, that the authors can shape, combine, and rework on them, and that the treatment of the oppressive urban environment, they call it a sleep, say, for example, this work called it Sleep, for example, is naturalistic, while its stream of consciousness is a modernist one. And modernism, still now, the avant-gardist form of modernism, symbolism, impressionism, they were all, say, the phenomena post-1910, 1905, till, say, realism has not somehow was intrigued by these avant-gardist forms, avant-gardist tools. And then the question of what about Emerson transcendentalism? This is where somehow transcendentalism by Emerson was more like a beneficial one, a source of that ultimate energy for the characters, and for taking into account Emile Zola's work, or for that matter, the literary naturalism, they were the souls of ultimate destruction. These natural forces were somehow hostile to the needs of their characters, and this is where both of them differ.